in on June 29th, 2022. I'm inching ever so closer to be at the new location. This is one of my runs back and forth to drop off some stuff. And I have been thinking about only inviting the love-worthy things into my life. And I've watched Marie Kondo Mari. It's a bit tricky remembering her name, but if you Google Japanese woman organization consultant, variations thereof, she'll come up in the first position. It's her thing. So she specifically talks about inviting love-worthy things into your life, holding them in your hands, and asking yourself whether your life is better because of it or not. And if it is, it gets to stay. And if not, it's gotta go. Now, the gotta go part of it is the challenge for me, because what do you do? I've got no family to dump it on. I've got no family storage, house I grew up in, all that kind of stuff is long gone. So I either need to pay for this stuff to be in public storage, or I need to just get rid of it. Now, when you look at how many times I've moved over the past 17 years, if you look even longer, because before I moved to New York City, I had lived in a few places as well. I moved to Virginia, I moved back from Virginia, and so there was a house I grew up in. There was a place on Shawmont Avenue. There was a place on Belmont Avenue. So that's 3. And then when I lived in Virginia, that was 4. So I was up to 4 by the time I moved to New York City. I lived in the Union Square area, Flatiron District, they call that. So that's 5. From there, I moved to 118th Street, the Columbia University area. That's 6. From there, I moved to Inwood, east of Broadway on Vermilion Street. So that's 7. From there, I moved across the street into the Grandpa's Pizza building. So that's 8. From there, I moved up onto the hill in Inwood into Park Terrace Gardens. That's 9. After Park Terrace Gardens, I moved to Irby in Staten Island. That's 10. From Irby, I moved out here to the Poconos. That's 11. Now from the Poconos, I'm moving back into the city. That's 12. So I've lived in 12 places over, let's see, if I can't say 17 years because that's just my New York City experience. So my time back and forth to Virginia, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Yeah, 8 years onto that, 17. 25, over a period of 25 years, I've lived in 12 places. That's about a move every 2 years. I'm averaging about a move every 2 years. If there was anyone who was a good candidate for living in a RV, it's me. Now, the only problem with that is the reason I'm moving back is for my kid. And it's going to be going hand in hand with creating remedies for situations that have been very disturbing. And in order to have those remedies in place, I can't be living in an RV. I have to be settled, have roots, such as it were. So it's a year-to-year lease in the place I'm taking. So we'll see. We'll see. I get done the things I need to get done. Under the new circumstances, under the new situation that's going to be created, I will reevaluate my options then. However, given my average of a new place every 2 years, I am not going to settle in too comfortable. In fact, the reason I bring up Kominari is the contraction to the most love-worthy things. Along with the distillation process comes the getting rid of clutter and distraction, and it allows greater focus. Now, I am not what you would call like an aesthetic, or what Steve Jobs used to do all the time, notoriously in his biography book that he had written, with that biographer, the official one. It talked a lot about how he would go on endlessly before they invited a new washing machine into their life, and it would go on for years because of the discussions of the merits of front loaders versus top loaders and all that stuff. And they had very few things, the same Apple aesthetic that characterizes Apple products, the cleanliness, the minimalism, also was Steve Jobs' personal aesthetic. So there wasn't much in his house or in his life. Not a lot of the trappings of the rich, such as it were. So I like that. I think that appeals to me, and I have to purge the pack rat. I have to get the pack rat in me under control, because it's easy to allow, every piece of your kid's artwork to be precious to you to a point where you just can't throw it out. There's something keeping you from doing it. But how much the more precious if you can digitize every bit of it, everything that's paper that's going to deteriorate anyway, you digitized. And everything that's acrylic or canvas, you take it off of the thick wood frames, you pack it all flat, and if you're going to put it up again in life, you can remount it. But in the meantime, it all packs flat, and you're keeping the stuff that's not going to be deteriorating by nature of being paper. All paper just dissolves away. Its own acid eats itself. Being a comic book collector, I can tell you this. So, all things paper should generally be purged, except for a handful of things that have special meaning that you'll like the tactile experience going through as it crumbles to dust in your hands. You're designing your future. You're designing your future experience. And one of the concepts, now I very rarely over those, all those times that I've moved, those 12 moves in 25 years, I have rarely been able to design it exclusively to my criteria. The vast majority of this time, for whatever reason, mostly because I'm weak, I could not even have a file cabinet. Now, imagine someone for whom structured organization, imposed structured organization that compels me to do the right things, because behavior arises from the way you rig the matter around you to remind you to do things, life hack tricks, suddenly living out of no file cabinet, and the files that once were easily accessible and pull-out drawers are now in boxes with lids that you have to search for and such. And even having places to sit was a challenge. Now, it's been greatly alleviated, and I'm actually coming back from a kind of a 10-year winter of, kind of antagonism towards organization. Now, the past 5 years have been kind of a recovery period, and I've got a file cabinet back in my life, and I'm getting organized, and I'm finding myself again. You know, one finds oneself often through the process of organization, self-management. And in doing so, I have come to understand that I'm designing a container. I'm designing a container unit. There are always the same similar elements in my life. No matter where I move, I either hunger for or set up. You know, for many years I hungered for a certain setup, but now that there's nothing stopping me, I actually can create a certain setup, which is kind of like an internal resource. I talk about Linux, Python, Vim, and Git being internalized assets. These are things inside of you. Even though they're external tools, all these things are physically manifested as bytes on computer systems. It's easier to imagine as an internalized asset because even the external manifestation is this imaginary information, bits and stuff. You know, its physical form is states of matter. The same hard drives that could be any one of infinite things happen to be organized into Linux and Python. So one can believe in the internalization of such tools as a part of you more easily. Someday it can be coded into your DNA. And heads-up displays, things like augmented reality and clever user interfaces could have it so that you could be doing, you know, dev type work, spontaneous creative dev work, which is right now the same way I'm vlogging. I could be coding. If you can do it in your mind, there's no reason an API couldn't be developed where you can just do it, you know, anywhere, anyhow, right? You see? So. A certain a certain desk, a certain situation with a desk that has a drawer in the front middle for all the main stuff you need to go to, and then a thing sitting on the desk that has little drawers in turn. So your main go-to stuff goes in the desk drawer, and it's a fixed location. It never moves. Stuff goes in there like, you know, credit cards that you don't carry, that kind of thing. So there's never any question of where to look for a certain type of object. And then things like keys and, you know, keys are the big one. Keychains, you know, any little things, screwdrivers for glasses, you know, tiny tools and stuff go in that other, you know, drawer-like unit sitting on the desk. Now, I have given up big computer monitors. I don't use them. Not interested. And it's in favor of just plain old laptops. The laptop that's, you know, the monitor that's built into a laptop is typically a plenty good monitor. 13-inch, 15-inch, it doesn't matter. 13-inch is plenty. You know why? Because you're not moving your head that much to read the text. There is a sweet spot for text. There's a sweet spot where you want to be working on stuff, bringing stuff into focus. You don't want to be looking over here, reaching over there, having this displayed over there. That breaks the flow. That breaks the flow exactly like taking your hand off of the monitor, or not the monitor, your hand off of the keyboard in order to use a mouse. When you take your hand off of the keyboard to use the mouse, you are interrupting the flow generally. Now, some people can stay in the flow. I've seen them, certain Adobe type users, because you're using the same Adobe software for so many years, and they can work at this speed of light. And so there are exceptions, but for the most part, the break in user interface systems, the switching between the keyboard and the mouse, interrupts the flow. It breaks it. It makes your executive function have to take over from muscle memory for a minute. And this was especially true when Microsoft changed the user interface for Microsoft Office. I'm not sure how many of you are old enough to remember. The Microsoft Office product used to be all drop-down menus. You clicked on a menu item, you went to a drop-down. The user interface has subsequently switched to what they call a ribbon user interface. So instead of having to go to a drop-down menu, they sort of expose with all these little chiclets all these user interface things so that you don't have to drill down. You don't have to go into the menu as much. And then they're kind of like little rearrangeable palettes. So positions that used to be very absolute positions and fixed became very relative and floating. And, you know, it was more powerful, granted. There's a lot more customizability, more options, more bringing options to the surface you didn't even necessarily know you had. However, it was a tremendous interruption to flow. And many people resented it. The relearning, it sets you back. It sets back your learnings by a year or two as you get expert at it again. And if you really consider it as a kind of expertise like martial arts, where you really want to be as fast at it as those Adobe type people I described, where you don't even want to stop and think, now it's really in the realm of that 10 years or 10,000 hours that's talked about in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book. Now, you can never put 10 years or 10,000 hours in on Microsoft software because it's not going to be the same in 10 years. It's going to be radically redesigned. It's going to be a completely changed interface, and therein lies the catch-22. That is the rub. So what you have to really end up doing is choosing timeless software if you want the advantage of muscle memory over time. And that timeless software tends to be the boring stuff, tends to be stuff that doesn't have a point-and-click user interface. Now, there are exceptions. I'm the first to admit that there are exceptions to this rule. And some software that you might consider timeless is going to have a mouse interface, but for the most part, not. So what is this timeless software, and why is it boring, and how can you get over the boring aspect of it in order to have better tech tools for life, better kung fu for life, muscle memory that will never let you down, that will never go away on you? Well, Unix and Linux. That's the first part of that answer. Unix/Linux won. The Nix operating systems won. I've made countless videos on this by this time. We know this because Microsoft is going out of its way to make it easy to install Linux side by side with Windows. It's now just a single command under Windows 11. Now, unfortunately, that single command installs a version of Linux for which it's very difficult to get Linux containers set up. And I'm talking about home now. I'm talking about changing homes 12 times in 25 years. Oh my God. Home is a container. Home is a projection, a visualization. Inside your head, it's internalized, but whoosh, desk. I can totally imagine the future of augmented reality making my extremely boring work environment instantiate anywhere. But I don't need augmented reality to do it because my needs are very simple. I work within a very tiny tool set. I need a laptop. Those low profile, good tactile feel keyboards that Apple innovated, that were the main thing on, say, their MacBook Airs, until they screwed up their keyboards and made them so flat. And I think they've come back. I haven't looked at Apple hardware in a long time, but they really lost me. They lost me when they started doing this kooky things with LED displays on the keyboards and taking away the low profile tactile keyboard in favor of a no profile, not tactile keyboard. It was terrible. It was like the chiclet keyboard of the Timex Sinclair. Ugh, Apple. So all this while, Microsoft hardware was just copying MacBook Air generation stuff, plus tablet, the Surface stuff they were doing. So with Microsoft getting all their Surface technology down for tablets, plus copying the general design of the MacBook Air, which was just perfect. It was one of those perfect expressions of, laptopiness, the clam design, the clamshell design of a laptop perfected. And I've had a few. I've owned a number of MacBook Airs in my day. So I believe in this stuff. I believe in that design. I believe in those low-profile keyboards that they've had on those things. And Microsoft has done a superb knockoff job. And, so much so that I have a few of those now. And they have touchscreens. They have very nice touchscreens, so they work with a stylus. And styluses are allowed to get into your muscle memory because the API is natural. It is that of a pencil. So what you're looking for is software that has a perfectly natural API, a perfectly natural API for stylus software. And you can allow yourself to go there, as opposed to many other software type things which have strong opinionated designs. Now, when you have a strong opinionated design that is not the Unix or Linux operating system, you have something that's going to become very dated and antiquated quite quickly. There are exceptions. Dominant, generalized programming languages are exceptions because they are very opinionated. C is very opinionated, Python is very opinionated, JavaScript is very opinionated. And JavaScript will stay around forever because it's built into the web browser, not because of Node.js, not because it's now being used for the full web stack. That's going to be a bit faddish. That's going to go like Ruby on Rails. It could stay, it could go, it just doesn't matter. No one's going to care because the flock runs from one set of tools to another. So they run from React to Angular to Vue, whatever. I got the order wrong. It was Angular to React to Vue. And they'll be flocking to the next thing and relearning. And it's the youth crowd. It's the youth crowd cutting their teeth on technology, enamored with their own abilities and willing to, scrap and relearn. You have to when you're getting started. You need to learn a bunch of things to have a robust enough knowledge base to be a generalized technology person. So for the first 2 or 3 relearn everythings, it's okay. Except that is a shame, because if it takes 10 years to truly master and you start your first one at 18, at 28 you're scrapping rebuilding, at 38 you're scrapping rebuilding. So by the time you're in your 40s, you're like, hey, maybe I ought to be on my last thing. Maybe I ought to actually get better at the same thing for, once I'm 10 years in, once I've achieved that level you would call mastery, how nice would it be to branch out in the mastery rather than throw everything out and start all over again and compete with all the youngins with the giant reset button pressed on you. How nice would it be to become one of these long in the tooth, know everything, has done everything more than once in more than one way, but under a system that has always been there and will always be there. The Unix operating systems qualify for that. Unix in particular qualifies for always has been there. But now because Linux has added to the groundswell of the Unix operating systems, because of Unix and Linux, has always been there, will always be there. Even Microsoft has yielded to that reality. So, if you want to work in a productive way, if you want to be productive, and I'm not talking in the Microsoft Office worker kind of productivity. Anyone can be a Microsoft Office software jockey. Anyone can learn Excel. Anyone can learn Microsoft Word. The barrier to entry to point and click and drag and hunt through the menu systems is low. It's designed so that the average person can do it. It is also designed so that it can drive economic cycles, so that it can drive quarterly profits, you see. It's designed so that there's always a new product, always an upgrade cycle, and the base of users is always running from one thing to the next, allowing the platforms themselves to gradually change and evolve. It keeps the vendors from being shut into all the decisions and being locked in, because the very definition of what Windows is, you feel it drifting over the years. Same with Mac. And, lots of money is made by all in that kind of environment, but it's not the only environment. It's certainly not the one that benefits the user. It's not a user-centric environment. It's a vendor-centric environment. And, these tools exist to serve the vendors and the shareholders of those vendor companies. Customers are the cattle to be corralled along and to be sheared every once in a while and to be milked and sometimes brought to slaughter. So, homie, don't play that anymore. Except you can't get away from it entirely. You can't get away from Microsoft. If you're an anti-Microsoft person and you're avoiding Microsoft technology out of principle, forget it. Put that out of your mind. Are you not going to use GitHub? If someone is going to ask you to collaborate on a project, are you not going to collaborate because Microsoft owns GitHub? It just doesn't make sense. And when you're getting ready to buy a laptop, are you automatically going to be spending $1,500 for an entry-level laptop that doesn't have a touchscreen and doesn't have a touchscreen, and then the Apple Pencil, which doesn't work with it, because it does, is terrible too? Or would you rather go with something where $600, $800 gets you just as good of a quality build? It gets you something which you can run Linux on that has a real software repository from Ubuntu. You don't have to rely on homebrew, so you got a better set of dev tools. And if you're into styluses like me, you get a better stylus. It's cheaper, it's better. It doesn't have to be recharged. It doesn't have a piece on the back to lose. And the back piece works as an eraser on the screen, or you can double click it for a screenshot. And then there's the two buttons on it to control menu items as you're drawing. So it's just a much better experience all around. And it's cheaper to boot. Cheaper to boot. Microsoft won on the hardware front. I'm sorry, Apple people. People like to, tout, ARM processors and everything. Well, you know what? Microsoft was there first. Microsoft had ARM tablets going back to their ones that ran that kooky little RT version of Windows. Nobody used it. It was a flop, but Apple had flops too. Apple had the Newton and things like it. So there's always flops, there's always attempts, and just because Apple has a really good implementation doesn't mean they invented it. Microsoft was on ARM first. At least in modern laptop type things and tablet type things. Of course, Apple was on ARM first because of the Apple Newton from back in the day. But in modern times, the only thing that makes Apple marginally better is how good of an implementation they did it, how high performance their ARM processors are compared to the Windows one. But, for now, I would say to get the best price thing, to get the best hardware for the dollar, stay away from ARM. To get the most stable software, to get the best dev tool support, just stay on x86 for a while. Get yourself on, Linux terminal under Windows with access to the Ubuntu software repo, and you're golden. It's a wonderful place to be. You get to learn all this timeless tech stuff, you see. You get to get good at things that are not going away. Ever? Things whose APIs are not going to be changing, dare I say ever? It's more like rarely. So, Linux APIs, Unix APIs do occasionally change. Linux in particular. I wouldn't be surprised if the Unix world has copied now what Linux has done. Well, it appeared in Unix first because Apple had to do it for, I went Turnpike North. No, I went Turnpike South. This is it. Sorry, I don't want to be an asshole here, but I am going to have to do this. All right. They'll let me in. Fireflies are cool. Okay. All right. The Unix Way is something that was put together by a team of people at AT&T, Bell Labs. It was Bell Labs before it was AT&T, in Murray Hill, New Jersey. And it was assembled by Ken Thompson into a single package. But he put together a number of different principles that pre-existed him. He didn't just invent all these wonderful things that became timeless about Unix. He borrowed, the everything is a file concept from one place. He borrowed that data can be piped between programs from another place. And then he borrowed this concept that there's really a small set of commands, each of which can do a broad variety of different behaviors based on their arguments and parameters, so that you strike the right balance of the number of tools you need to know, how flexible those tools are, right? The fewer tools you use, the more flexible they need to be. The less flexible the tools are, the more tools you need. So Unix sets that balance so that you get some 20 necessary command line things you need to understand: current directory, list files, that kind of stuff. It's not a lot. It's easier than programming to navigate around a Linux or Unix system. It's really quite easy. And this is that text terminal stuff that scares so many people away, that Steve Jobs went on almost a war against, right? This is computers the way nobody should have to use them. This is computers the way everyone who learns to use them that way now becomes timeless and is not locked into this crazy vendor-driven world that Steve Jobs helped create in computers. The home computer market did it too. It wasn't just Steve Jobs. This is the way it was with Ataris and Commodores and Radio Shacks and everything that came before it. Had a Christmas season, buying cycle that drove development. You had to have the next model out for the next Christmas season, incrementally better, so that everyone needed that new feature. So Steve Jobs just took that and said, hey, let's do that in the $2,500 market instead of the $250 home computer market. Let's do that up here and have a new model of Mac every few years. It was the Mac 128K. Can you believe it? 128K. It wasn't 128 megabytes. It was 128 kilobytes. Then they had the 512 kilobyte, and then a 1 megabyte Mac. And then they had the Mac SEs, and they went from a beige design to a platinum design, but they were all still black and white, square black and white pixels. The soda can, I think they called them the soda can design. You'll find some nice fish tanks made out of them today. And then Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple. John Sculley took over, the ex-CEO of Pepsi, who did the Pepsi Challenge, right? So, Macs became color under Sculley's reign and became much more expensive than PCs, and only artists wanted them, and it had this elitist attitude surrounding it. And then the gigahertz race kicked in, because this is when, gaming cards, 3D gaming cards kicked in, and GPUs, Radeon and NVIDIA and Radeon cards, I think, were the battle. Sound Blaster cards, and the Mac couldn't keep up, and the Mac started to look very, very obsolete. And so they begged Steve Jobs to come back. He did, and one of the principal things Steve Jobs did when he came back was he changed the Mac to be based on Unix, under the advice of his friend Stephen Wolfram, the same Stephen Wolfram as Wolfram Alpha Mathematica type software that helps you with your college math work. And it was a good idea. It kept the Macs relevant. So instead of just the hotsy-totsy artists who somehow managed to have the money for these Macs, I guess it's graphic designers, commercial graphic designers using Quark Express back in those days. That's about when I was going to college and was exposed to those, overpriced, underpowered color Macs. And there was really nothing exciting about them, especially as an Amiga user. Non-flickering square color pixels. I coveted that a little, right? The quality of the Mac's color screen was really nice compared to an Amiga's flickering screen and non-square pixels. So Macs had that for sure. But in all other regards, all the cool stuff, the animation, the Amiga had it hands down. But the Amiga went away, and all this Unix-like stuff I learned on the Amiga. I was like, oh, my 10 years, 10,000 hours, although I didn't know the concept then, but I really felt the pain. I felt the pain of investing so much into the Amiga. What I didn't realize is that so much about the Amiga was Unix, was NIC's operating system principles. It was a parallel development effort to Unix, smaller. It used something called like the TOPS OS or something. So the Amiga disk operating system, Amiga DOS, wasn't born from scratch. It was born from a preemptive multitasking system that was developed under BCPL somewhere in Britain. It was a British creation by the person who created BCPL, the thing that made the C programming language possible, the thing that got the Unix effort booted They started out developing Unix on BCPL, and they realized it wasn't good enough for a full operating system, so Dennis Ritchie created C, inspired by BCPL. BCPL, meanwhile, wasn't living in an island. It was being used to great effect, and it created, I think it's called the TOPS operating system, by the same guy who created BCPL. He's like, oh, let me create a preemptive multitasking system with this. And that's what was taken as the starting point for the Amiga disk operating system. Amiga DOS came from that. And then all the windowing stuff was laid over it by Dale Luck. That was called Intuition. It's a little bit different. You know, I can take or leave windowing operating systems. It's just like any other. It's got its close gadget, its maximize and minimize and resize. One windowing environment is just like any other. I take or leave any of them, it doesn't matter. But the underlying stuff, everything being a file, piping data between things, the ability to write bash scripts. They weren't called bash scripts, of course, on the Amiga. They were just script files. And there was a startup script, and it was called the startup script. And you could edit it and control how your Amiga started up, and you could really customize things easily on the Amiga. And so I learned all that stuff on this parallel to Unix Bizarro track. And so all my anger at the Amiga, the very, very cool Amiga computer going away, has subsequently transitioned into a kind of gratitude that that level of stuff was made accessible to people like me. I couldn't even afford the $1,200 Amiga at the time. My parents were just divorced, and I was going to college, and my dad had to take loans and student loans, you know, for me to go to college. So we were really penny pinching. I didn't even get a new Mac. I tried to go to Drexel University with my Amiga emulating a Mac, but they wouldn't let me do that. So I bought a used Mac. It was my first soda bottle, or, you know, soda can style Mac. I think I had the 512. Very underpowered. I hardly ever used it. I used the Amiga and emulating the Mac all the time. It was just as good. Better. It's such a stunning environment. Think. Points that I'm making there. What is home? What is home? Home starts with Unix and Linux, because it ain't gonna change on you. The image that you create in your head, your roots, such as it were, aren't gonna change on you. The practical matters of mapping of things, because you spend a lot of time mapping, creating synaptic pathways in your mind that represent synaptic pathways, or represent pathways, locations, spatial relation type things in the real world. Your first neighborhood you grow up in is kind of special, because you learn where things are relative to each other. And that serves you through life. It serves you through life. Having that ability to map new things. Now, some people find it hateful. I'm one of those people who finds the new mappings hateful. And that the old mappings and that first stuff you learn has a satisfying feel to it. It releases serotonin, the hearth and home neurotransmitter that makes you feel cozy and comfortable. So it's always in your best interest to make the first things you learn, your first synaptic pathways of a new type, mapping out a new land, a new system. It's best to choose things that are going to be timeless, so that you get compounding returns over time, and you don't have to scrap and rebuild every 10 years. Now, if I had to move every 10 years, I'd be quite grateful. My average is every 2 years. I'm rethinking stuff. I'm rethinking stuff out of necessity, because while I'm not going to be in an RV until this whole situation regarding my kid is resolved, I am thinking along those lines. What is home? How easy should a move be? How can I change my physical location without allowing my productivity and my mental space and my muscle memory from taking a hit? Like, at all. Like, how can I remain a master of my destiny and be working at full productive tilt, working at full tilt, pedal to the metal, full speed ahead, when things change around me because of platform changes, because of fashion and fad, because of fundamental improvements in technology, that it has little to no bearing on me, except for wrapping in the newness that I just need to know, because occasionally there's newness that you need to know. It happens. But now you have that much more capacity left available for that, you see. That's so important. System D is one of those types of things. I started talking about it. Apple innovated certain things in order for Unix system services to run on a Mac. They had to do it. Unix itself wasn't mature enough for Apple's needs, being the host to the Macintosh operating system. So it kind of hosts the Macintosh operating system, because no one thinks of a Mac as being Unix in particular, because you do everything through point and click, and that point and click is Cocoa, the Cocoa API to the graphics. But behind the scene, housework had to happen. System services had to run. So they did it under Darwin. Apple did it under their Darwin version of Unix. And then I got to get the people's name. That was copied for the Linux world, and it was called System D. And it was embroiled in controversy because systems that are that ambitious, alterations that led to altercations, things that take over so much responsibility for how the system runs. Well, that kind of stuff doesn't happen very often in the Unix world. Such big changes. The API is supposed to just not change. These things are supposed to be timeless. So, system services were not well thought out enough for Apple's use, so they thought it out better. That better thinking was copied in the Linux world. It was called System D, and gradually became embraced by every major Linux distro. It's a big deal when Debian picks it up. Debian, from which Ubuntu was derived, because they're the ones who created the last system service management system called init, or init.d if you prefer, where you just write a bunch of bash scripts to start and stop services, to enable them, and you use like this control system or system control. I never even learned it all that well. It was, I did a few Linux services under that, but I very much came to appreciate why people hated it. You had to be a bash script guru. Nobody wants to learn, Unix script just to start and stop services and stuff, or to create the interface to start and stop services. The code you have to copy and paste from, you got to find examples that are relative to you. It's just horrible. It was a mess. So even Debian switched over to System D. It much simplified this whole picture. You dropped certain formatted files in location, and you had a service. You could start and stop, restart, enable it, disable it. And all the things people complained about gradually get worked out. It mostly has to do with it being a monolithic piece of software that makes a grab at a lot of security responsibilities. Separation of user space from system space, and not creating new hacking surface, right? Whenever you have something like that, now System D can be hacked. Injection of new services running on systems by knowing what to do. And that stuff is just gradually worked out. Those bugs don't last forever. Everyone will choose a better API, even for a text-based environment, when it clearly improves daily workflow. So for people like me who view Linux system services as an alternative to web development. I hate web development. Web development is stupid. I might like it again. I can see myself coming around to liking web development again. But right now, the Node.js full web stack JavaScript framework du jour, no thank you. Not in a million years. It's a way to sabotage a career at my age. You can't do it. But all the Python stuff that does similar things, yeah, sign me up. I'm not a Django person. I don't do the Django framework. But the Django API changes gradually enough over a long enough period of time that Django is wiser than any JavaScript framework. Better still is Flask. The Flask API just doesn't change. Everyone is trying to get you to move to fast API. Every time you listen to Talk Python to me, it's fast API, fast API. Then you have to use Pedantic and control your data types and have automatic cloud services connecting in. Yeah, whereas you just use Flask and it works the same way as it worked for the last, I don't know, 10 years. Like, and then, you know, Python adds concurrency, non-blocking I/O, the async await keywords. Flask embraces it without changing the API, without breaking all the previous code. So Flask continues to hold the mantle of the great unchanging web service and all web things Python piece that you can really rely on, you can hang your hat on. Requests for making HTTP requests is a little bit of a disappointment because they did not embrace the concurrent world so well, but it's been filled in. Someone else is scratching the itch by creating HTTPX, a completely requests API compatible component to do all the same things, but it also supports async await natively without G events and all this other stuff you have to do for requests, which is ridiculous. Okay, so where from here? It's a discussion of home. So home is where your Unix and Linux are, because the great unchanging APIs, which now include systemd, the latest change, the latest change to the great unchanging API. All right, so I'm gonna have to focus on this turn. My visibility is a little bit limited, but I'm gonna do it slow enough that if, yeah, they let me, good. All right. The next thing is, you know, other things, like that's your desk and your laptop, you know, Linux and Unix. Now all these other things around it are your language choice. Python is a decent bet on the non-changing API front. Python takes changes to the API very seriously. And when it changes too much, like even just adding parentheses to the print statement, it will tear the community apart. And it's not gonna be done very often, for reasons I've talked about in prior videos. No one wants to break Python 3 now that everyone has kind of resettled onto Python 3. Yes, I got to my lane, good. This is my last lane change. Okay. Python 3 forever. Trust me on this, it's gonna be a good 5 years before any serious discussion of Python 4 starts happening. And so you can hang your hat on it. Text editor wise, Vim, Emacs if you prefer, you know, choose any text editor you want so long as it's Vim or Emacs, or variations thereof, because once you learn the Vim way, the VI way, you can go to NeoVim or whatever. And And once you learn the Emacs way, you can do whatever the whoosh with more powerful wizards, right? Instantiate home. Instantiate a new home. That's what I'm doing right now. And I'm going to use that Korimono, the Japanese organization woman's techniques about the love-worthiness to get it down to just the things I want. And I'm even going to go a step further in designing this place. I have a fairly long room. A longer room than I've had in a long time. One end is designed to be the kitchen or the eating area, the dining area, and the other has the big window and is the living area. And it's long to get from one to the other. I'm going to put shelves right in the middle, which is going to be kind of like a digestion filter device, where I'll put everything in on one side, probably on the dining side, and then sort it through a double depth or maybe even a triple depth of shelves. So by the time it comes out on the living area side, I will have evaluated, reduced, and yeah, that's it. Digestion. I'm going to be digesting everything I own through that center shelf unit as I bring it from public storage and I put it in on one side of the shelf. I'll just slide it through it as if it were going through a sort of intestinal system. And if it's paper stuff that needs to be scanned, I'll do it. If it needs to be further archived, I'll find a way to do it. But most matter doesn't matter. Anything that can be reacquired, anything that would not work in my future RV life, anything that I would have to pay to store, I will purge. There will be some exceptions with the kids stuff. We got snowboards this season. I thought it was going to be years at Shawnee Mountain. I thought we were going to be the snowboarding people. I almost bought it for myself as well, but now I have the snowboarding equipment for my kid. I'm not throwing that out. It's going to be decoration, maybe decoration on the wall here. Those are going to be the difficult ones. But for the most part, anything that's mine, if it's only me that's going to miss it, the information is more important, and activating it in my life. And then interesting projects, I'll work with you on the cloud, because of course once it's digital, I'm going to be managing it from Linux containers. Linux containers under the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is a hard thing to do right now. It was hard to pull off. I had to get just the right magic combination of stuff, and I nailed it. And I'm getting familiar with the LXC API, which has a lot of little weird, surprising nuances in it. It's not what I expected at all. So yeah, I'll wrap up there, and I'll pick up and describe to you more about all this wonderful stuff of finding a new home that is always with you, internalized.